Hi, everyone. Thanks for sticking around. And I think this has been fantastic. I really the diversity of talks and has really been fantastic. And now we're going to have some discussion and presentations and sort of a wrap up from two notable speakers. And we're going to start with Hugh Garavan and Ziva Cooper. We're going to start with Ziva Cooper. Ziva is the director of UCLA Center for Cannabis and Cannabinoids in the Jane and Terry Semil Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior, and she's a professor at UCLA Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences and Anesthesiology. Her research involves understanding variables that influence both the therapeutic potential and adverse effects of cannabis and cannabinoids, the chemicals in the cannabis plant, including their sex-dependent effects. She got her PhD from the University of Michigan in biopsychology in 2007 in the field of preclinical psychopharmacology. And her experience that informs her focus on translating preclinical studies of cannabinoids to the clinic using placebo-controlled human drug administration experiments. So, Ziva?
Thank you, Rita. It's so lovely to be here and to see Jill Becker from way back in graduate school, who I have a question for. So our jobs are to kind of synthesize the conversation and really talk about steps to move forward. And so you'll recall that the idea of bringing us all together here was to help develop a multidisciplinary framework to study sex-dependent effects in the framework of substance use disorders in order to help identify risk factors, prevent the development of substance use disorders, and also to treat substance use disorders in a way that aligns with the sex-dependent effects that we would see preclinically and also in human studies. So there are a couple of themes that kind of popped out, but I want to touch on a couple of themes that I think deserve comment. Everybody only got 10 minutes to share years, decades of work. And so I think when we think about the multidisciplinary perspective and variables that can impact the trajectory from initiation of substance use, developing a substance use disorder, abstinence to treatment, some things that popped out, of course, was looking at development as a variable that impacts behavior, initiation of substance use, the impact of those substances on brain and behavior. And there was a nice focus on puberty, adolescent, and young adults. But it's interesting that that we didn't talk too much about pregnancy or menopause. I think two stages of development that I think, especially in the cannabis field, we know that rates of cannabis is increasing among pregnant women. We know that older adults are using cannabis more. And I think that's true across the spectrum of substances of abuse. And so we know that there are considerable hormonal changes during those periods of time that could impact things. Pharmacology, we heard a lot about stimulants and cocaine. Thank you, Rita, for talking about opioids. We heard a little bit about alcohol, but understanding the interaction between the substance that's being used and how that impacts the sex-dependent effects is going to be really important, both with respect to, I think, the pharmacokinetics, how is the drug being used, route of administration, as well as the pharmacodynamics. And so that's going to have, I would expect, and this has been shown, the sex-dependent effects of substances, the substance itself is going to have a driving effect. We talked about trajectory. So from initiation, abstinence to treatment, I'm thinking about craving. And so Rita presented really nice data on craving and how there's differences between the luteal and follicular phase. And in my head, I was thinking, okay, well, what does that mean for relapse and drug-taking behavior? Comorbidities, Tony touched on the comorbidities. And also something to think about is when we, with the HEAL initiative with NIH, not just psychiatric comorbidities, but certain medical issues that are specific to male and female populations. So for example, fibromyalgia, certain pain conditions where there's an intersection between risk factors for developing substance use disorders and those types of comorbidities. And I'm going to stop in just a minute, but one thing that just kept on coming up in my head was, this idea that estradiol or the estrus phase, we know that females are more sensitive to the pharmacological effects of substance abuse. And in my head, I was trying to think, how is this adaptive? Why does this happen? And Jill, I was remembering back in 2002 when you were teaching us hormones of behavior and how important or the role that estrus plays in memory and learning. And just thinking about, here we were highlighting the negative effects of estradiol on sensitivity to drugs, but could this also be, prime time for learning or a prime time for using pharmacotherapies that females might also be more sensitive to help with substance use disorders? So those are just a couple of things that were on my mind. Hugh?
Wait, I have to.
Rita, sorry about that.
So it's great to have Hugh here. He's a professor in the Department of Psychiatry, the University of Vermont. His research uses structural and functional neuroimaging to study cognitive control and reward processes, with a particular interest in how functional changes in these systems can contribute to addiction and related mental health issues. His primary research focus of the last few years has been adolescent neurodevelopment, including risk factors for psychopathology and drug use. He played a key role in major longitudinal multi-site imaging genetic studies such as the ENIGMA addiction, Imogen in Europe, HBCD study of over 7,000 pregnant people and their children from birth to age 10, and the ABCD study, which is looks at over 11,000 adolescents in the US. He's published over 400 papers in the fields of cognitive neuroscience and addiction.
Thank you. So this has been great. What a range of topics. I've learned an awful lot. So thank you all for your presentations, and thank you everybody, especially Valentino, for putting all this together. What fun. So I'm going to try to keep my comments short because I'm sure there are other people with more intelligent things to share than me. My comments are primarily going to focus on human studies just because that's what I do, and even more particular, probably more specific to neuroimaging, but hopefully these are some of the thoughts are applicable elsewhere. The big focus here for me now is sort of steps forward, but I'm going to start off by being a curmudgeon. So in my reading of the literature on sex differences, especially in the human studies, I'm always a bit disappointed by a number of things that I see in the papers. So I thought I would share that with you. There's nothing too profound here, but I don't know. I think they're kind of important issues to address as we go forward. The first are that, most studies I've seen looking at sex differences are very badly underpowered. I mean, we know we have this whole issue with neuroimaging, the replication crisis, so on and so forth. I think this is especially true when we look at sex differences. Without having adequate power, you can really just kind of skim the, potential influence of sex differences. You can't look at stratifying variables. I mean, what about sex differences, stratified by socioeconomic status or psychopathology or across different races and ethnicities? Studies very often don't have equal numbers of males and females in their analyses, which is really kind of funny, because then they find it, funny is the wrong word, but they find an effect in one sex and not in the other, and without addressing the fact that there might be differential power in this. So there are ways to address that. You can we can get into the statistical ways for addressing that if we want. It's funny, there is, as we were just saying in the chat there was this mandate to include males and females in your research study, but it didn't come with an increase in budget to include your sample size to ensure that you've got sufficient adequate numbers of males and females for your analyses. Related to this small point, I'm amazed by how many studies don't actually do the formal test of an interaction. They will test for male-female differences in, let's say, test for user control differences in males, and let's say find an effect and test for them in females and not find an effect, and then conclude that there's significant differences between the sexes without a very, very simple thought, very easy, but without actually doing the formal test for a statistical interaction. There's often this assumption if you find some sort of sex differences that it must be related to kind of really interesting, neurobiological differences. I find there's an inattention to consumption-related behavioral differences. I mean, some of what maybe Anna was showing about Gen Z, maybe things are changing, but, historically, there's different patterns of how males and females drink, the amounts, the frequency, the binging, smoking topography, number of puffs, duration of puffs, that type of thing. These things differ. So maybe those are the critical issues that underlie the sex differences. And then there's the whole world of just, physiological difference, metabolic differences, body fat composition. So, one might find differences in the human studies, but really, making a strong case that it's due to some inherent neurobiological differences, I think it is a challenge. The big issue, and I'll get done with my gripes in a second. They're not really gripes, but notes, is that very often I find that, certainly in the neuroimaging literature, that analyses of sex differences are opportunistic and after the fact. Somebody realizes that, oh, here's a quick post hoc analysis that I can do. And I don't think that's really ideal. If you think that, for example, there are different causes, different etiologies, different factors that are relevant to male and female, dependence, you really need to make sure that you've measured all those things in a kind of prospective, proactive way. So I think the field as a whole, and again, my focus here is largely on the human work and perhaps largely on the human imaging work, needs to do a better job of adequately addressing all these questions. A few other quick observations, and I'll stop talking. Things that jumped out at me from the presentations today, the animal models are, of course, hugely valuable, right? Because they can kind of circumvent a lot of these concerns, that not necessarily all of them, and they have their own concerns, with regards to translatability and so on and so forth. But I think they're very, very valuable. Something that always surprises me is that there aren't more pharmacological human neuroimaging studies. And that seems like especially true here. This could be a very interesting way to maybe get at these mechanisms. I think the examples we were shown of exploiting differences across the menstrual cycle in women is a very clever approach to maybe trying to get at these types of things, where there may be limitations to the pharmacological challenges that you can do. I thought attention to lifespan effects is really interesting. It's not something I've really thought about, hard, but as was just mentioned there by Ziva, looking at adolescence and the puberty and pregnancy and menopause, that really needs to be done to come up with a kind of comprehensive understanding of all that's going on. And then last thought that was mentioned a bunch, the role of psychopathologies. So, this thing that's endemic to substance abuse research that we all tend to ignore, the huge rates of comorbidities in addicts, in substance-dependent individuals. And if they differ systematically between males and females, then that's another whole world of things that we need to understand, because that could be an important driver of these apparent sex differences. But I'll just finish again with my favorite point, and it was related to Rita's introduction for the sort of work that I do. We really need substantially large samples to get a proper handle on these phenomena. And I'll leave it with that and turn back over to Rita for the group discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Hugh. Those were great, very insightful comments and putting this this very diverse meeting together. I'm gonna start and then hopefully we'll get some other questions in the chat. But when I think about the development and this whole lifespan issue of lifespan, I think what's really been left out is the postpartum period, and this is really important because the incidence of maternal mortality is rising greatly in this country. It's a public health crisis. About 50% occurs in the postpartum period, and about 50% of that is due to mental health and substance use disorder. So we know that the brain is changing during pregnancy. We talk about changes like adolescence and early life as being these windows of vulnerability, and so is pregnancy and the postpartum period, that whole year after pregnancy, and it's been really not investigated at all. So it's not a sex difference thing, I realize, but it really is a crisis, and so I think some attention should be brought to it. So then my other question, waiting for others, but I did have another question, in that, Hugh, you spoke about the challenges in recruiting and increasing the number of female patients, but maybe now that we're generating these large data sets, and there are large data sets, and you know about this, to leverage that, maybe that's going to be some help and allow us to advance the field further. They're doing secondary analyses.
Yeah, I
from
agree. And Anna gave a very nice presentation. They're talking about how we can.
Yeah, that's what the ABCD will do. We're just starting to get large numbers of papers that are being generated from people leveraging those data. Sex difference papers are coming out of that, and the HBCD will generate the same as well. Valentina.
Yeah, so a few different thoughts. I'm thinking, how do we move things forward, and what strategies and tactics can we implement? So I think maybe like what you suggested, we can be piggyback. So I'm just trying to think, how do we move things forward? I think we can join forces and do multi-site studies, piggyback on consortia like ENIGMA addiction, rather than meta-analysis, mega-analysis, even of behavioral data and experimental data, where we try and disaggregate the findings by sex and look at these effects as well, so that we can see where the signal is. I think, what can we do now, right? Joining forces. And of course, that in the meantime, we can still apply for new funding and get some new ideas, of course. Perhaps even joining forces, developing some sort of general guidelines in terms of what each study should be doing. Even if there's a study that doesn't look at sex differences, there might be some key elements that each study should be keeping an eye on, whether, but again, it depends on the feasibility. So if there's a big survey of psychological data, you might not have enough time and capacity, if it's not the primary research question, to ask about the phases of menstrual cycle. Maybe there's shorter questions than longer ones, but perhaps there's some fundamental things that are probably about sex and gender that more studies should cover, rather than, if studies have a little bit more capacity, then that's when we can, add questions about psychopathologies, rather than the menstrual cycle, rather than taking the pill, rather than life cycle specific elements, or things like that. And then some sort of at the top, the most resource intensive will be more hormones, fMRI combined with. So I think that maybe we need to keep it kind of realistic and just think about what can different disciplines do within the funding, the normal funding that each discipline has, without being disruptive. So just some little tweaks that we could implement to improve the field. I also was wondering if people feel free to raise your hand as well. I think it's a bit tricky perhaps to jump in when everybody's talking at the same time as well. There's quite a few people in the room, so please feel free to raise your hand. But I'm just thinking to join forces and maybe come up with some guidelines and some direction in terms of that's what we should be thinking about. Another thought I was having is in terms of the stats, because a lot of studies have less females than males, but it could still be that even if the meta-analyses are in males, because then you have the sample size and you get effect sizes and all of that, still perhaps reporting the smaller female sample data, whether it's the appendix or supplementary, just pilot results. Having it out there is always better than not having it. So if we have meta-analysis, we can pick up on these effects, or we can plant some seeds for future work, rather than not having visibility at all. So I was just wondering what people think about that, some general consensus about what key metrics and what key parameters do we need to keep pushing forward.
Anyone? Ziva, you had your hand up earlier.
Yeah, I don't know if Valentino was touching on this, but I think that utilizing large data sets and being able to collaborate across labs is so important, given how hard it is to recruit this population, especially if you want to look at different menstrual cycle phases. Rita, I don't know if you said that it took 10 years to get the funding. I don't know how long it took you to do the study, but for me, I'm doing drug administration during a specific time of the cycle, and it's really hard. So I'm just thinking, if there are, standards or some unified way that data are collected, even, we do the menstrual cycle follow back along with like a timeline follow back for substance use, do menstrual cycle follow back, finding out if people are on birth control, making sure, and I know that there's been papers and guidelines about this, but I still see that there's discrepancies between research groups with respect to asking people about gender, asking people about sex, and what the categories are. You know, with NIH, you know, if you're an NIH researcher, you have to report things in a very certain way. And in a way, that's nice, right? Because we're all collecting data that way. But there aren't specific guidelines. Actually, Rita, I don't know. Are there specific guidelines now for reporting gender? I don't think there is. I don't think we're required to ask participants about gender.
I don't think so, but
I don't think it's in there yet.
What I was just thinking about was the All of Us. So their goal is to recruit. This is a big data set with electronic health records, and we're adding questions now about drugs use, and that's probably asking questions about sex and gender. I don't think they have I think it's mostly just adults now, and they've recruited at least 600,000 people, and the goal is 1 million. So these are data sets that can be leveraged, and the information is going to be pretty harmonized. So you have your hand up again, Ziva.
I'm sorry, I'm chatty. I've been sitting in this room by myself for a couple hours. But and also, Rita, so the All of Us study is going to have such great data as the ABCD study. But here, Valentina, you gather people from all over the world, and just thinking about, how drug availability and practices and culture vary so much between countries, across countries, that we can learn a lot just from that as well. I feel bad that we're leaving out the now. Sorry, preclinical people. It's hard to do global studies of animal models.
Anna,
Yeah, I just want to say, I do believe that, big data sets are amazing. But it would also be nice if we can use our creativity to have many studies. And in order to then, merge this data, like what might be helpful, a bit along the lines of what Hillary suggested in the chat, is that I know there's efforts to have an addiction battery, and there's been various attempts to come up with a set of measures for an addiction battery. I think we also need a battery on how to assess what do we need to assess what's important for gender differences. So for example, the hormonal cycle tracking, how do we do this? When I started, I wanted to do this, and it was considerable effort to sort of figure out how to do it, because I didn't know where exactly to turn.
Valentina, and then Hugh.
Well, first of all, I just want to say Mariana is monitoring the questions, so there might be some questions that need reading. So Mariana or Erin, feel free to jump in and raise your hand and maybe read it. For people that might not feel comfortable turning on the camera and asking the questions, just this is the housekeeping thing. But I'm thinking we have people from all over the world now who are interested in the topic, and they're interested in addiction. So if there's any way to leverage on this team, and perhaps we can organize a follow-up in 12 months and see where we're at, and maybe, bring in some different elements and even so something like that. So I was wondering if people can raise their hand or something if they're interested, or just let us know in any way, because I think this is just the beginning. We're not going to fix everything today, so it's just how do we keep in communication together. And the second part, just another couple of points, is we basically need to be discussing things now and set the parameters now. If we think about how long it takes to translate research to the actual word, by the time we new study, collect data, complete data, publish, clinical relevance, public health, if we want things to be different in 20 years' time and have better understanding of mechanisms and how to inform personalized treatment, we need to have these discussions now. So if we even start doing some little tweaks to the practices that we have, it doesn't have to be a transformation of how we conduct our research. I do think there's a lot we can do with very little, because we know so very little. So these are more two comments. And the last thing, I'll just have a question for actually Tony. Sorry for throwing you under the bus, but I wonder from your clinical perspective, because you really, seeing patients and doing trials, but also the psychiatry angle. What do you think from your part, seeing people who present to services, what do we need to do more of in these more basic studies rather than what do we need to do more of that can translate a bit more better for people who show up to treatment services?
That's a really loaded question, Valentina, because there's this huge dissociation between the science and what happens in clinics, and part of the problem is, clinicians, they may have gone to medical school, they may have done graduate work and stuff like that, but the clinical world is unforgiving. I've worked in the US and Canada, and I know this is true everywhere. People don't have a chance who are seeing patients often to keep up with the literature, right? And, at the same time, clinician scientists, whether you're a physician or what, you're seeing patients, hopefully you're thinking, I make these observations, how can I get this back to the lab? How can I talk to colleagues in the lab? Erin Calipari and I were having this conversation about a month ago when I was in Nashville. And that's one of the big struggles is clinicians, they have all these observations, but there's not ways to translate it back. And so, that's why I think meetings like this are so important, because it gets people talking. And, that's the biggest gap right now we have is, just to emphasize Hugh's point, not enough subjects, right? And so many interesting questions and so many post hoc analyses, and clinicians just aren't finding out what's going on in the scientific world, and they're not probably able to share what they're observing back to scientists. And I think that gap is a huge issue for moving things forward.
Rita?
Yeah, so I want to point to another gap that I see. And I did say it facetiously a little bit that 10-year that took me and 14 submissions that took me to get that grant. But I have and then the study itself, we started actually the last month of 2020 during COVID at the end of it that year, and then finished in 2024. We're still collecting data. But I feel that there is this type of perception that these issues are not that important. Sex differences, menstrual cycle effects, they're just not, I feel like they're not perceived as scientific enough or important enough. How significant is it? Why do you want? I get this constantly. So, for example, we had a most wonderful panel submitted to ACNP with the Rita Lipari, computational staff, Anna Konova. It was really translating from rodents to humans and focusing very much on dopamine functions. And I think that this year at ACNP, none of the sex-related type of submissions were accepted. And in my mind, I think it actually shows how we need a focus on women's health. And in this way, if we have that focus, then reviewers will say, oh, okay, this is important, not only the other the bipolar disorders, schizophrenia, depression, addiction, but women's health across psychiatry, across cognitive function and neuropsychology and all of the good stuff. And we don't have that as a field in neuroscience or in clinical. So the gap is all the way from basic neuroscience to clinicians and back and everywhere we look at. That's kind of what I feel in this, because I'm doing many different types of studies, and this one of them was one of the most uphill battles. I have another one, but that's a different story, but both are definitely uphill battles.
There might be another motivation, Valentina, for the sort of paper that maybe you were envisioning. Seems like it's not a bad idea to put a paper together articulating why sex differences are interesting, or as has been mentioned a bunch of times, that, sex differences, even if you don't care about the sex differences per se, but that they give you all sorts of interesting insights into mechanisms. And then, that same paper could also touch on best practices, if, that's the right way to phrase it, but in terms of what sort of measures to acquire, the menstrual cycle, timeline follow back type of, issue, or how best to measure sex and gender, and then some of the kind of analytic issues. I mean, it strikes me, everything takes longer than it does, but it wouldn't be a bad deliverable from this gathering to put those together and get that sort of a paper out. The other thing I want to do is shamelessly plug the ENIGMA addiction consortium that I just happened to lead, which is incidental, but it is trying to pool neuroimaging data. We do have, tens of thousands of cases and controls. We got Team 1 structure. This is for all the human neuroimagers out there, resting state diffusion imaging, and it's over almost 200 studies, and it is also multicultural. So we tend to pool all these data sets together to maximize, its statistical power, but there is the cross-cultural element to it. So there is potential to explore that as well with these data sets. Okay, shameless plug complete. Erin.
I just had a couple of things I wanted to mention. One was there's also the ENIGMA endocrinology group that I'm part of, and they are trying to pull together all the endocrinology data, particularly looking at female sex hormones and cycles, to then, tease apart some of these questions that we've got about, how do we measure things appropriately, and how does it impact brain and function. Another comment was Emily Jacobs' group, I believe, is working on a paper right now articulating the bare minimum, or not even the bare minimum, actually, I should say the gold standard of how we should be measuring sex hormones, menstrual cycle, the questions we should be asking. So I think there's a lot of stuff we can do interdisciplinary, working with, our group and other groups like the Jacobs group that are doing that sort of stuff. I think it's brilliant that we've come together because it's very rarely considered in the field of addiction. And it's great that we're highlighting today how important it is. And as Valentina said, it's a real starting point and a place where we can hold ourselves accountable and all of our colleagues and our students and new projects that we're setting up, trying to make sure we're thinking about these things from the get-go. And then along the way, we'll develop gold standard processes as well. But I guess that's kind of something we can start with.
Thanks, Erin. And I'm also thinking about, well, first of all, I think that Rita has mentioned there's a White House initiative to women's health. Then it's good to know. Thank you.
Yes. So that, well, it was about several months ago, and so President Biden signed, it's an initiative, and they're dedicating a certain amount of funds to this. And then, of course, it depends. We don't know what's going to happen with the election, but there's a big awareness in Congress and at the White House, and hopefully that'll continue. And Jill and I are actually going to go down and give a couple of minutes spiel down there. So we're excited about that.
For our European friends, do we have an understanding of where Europe's at in terms of that?
I don't, but I think Linda Montanari, she had lead because it's very, very, very late in Europe at the moment. But we can definitely follow up with her as well. She's involved with the EUDA, and I think perhaps in Australia we can follow up as well on our end. But basically, I think you guys are leading the way in North America, which is great for us to see, paving the way.
Marianne?
Yeah, I just wanted to flag that there is a couple of questions from the chat. One coming from Juliana, and it's more of a common question. He's saying that most of the studies the presentations that were part of the workshop today were data that were collected at a single site. How can efforts for multi-site, non-a priori studies, let's say for grant writing purposes of future papers, implement what has been discussed today, particularly if certain sites only acquire male participants, with larger pooled data sets, especially if the focus is sex-related differences? How have others addressed this, particularly with human models? To just exclude sites who only include a single sex, or question mark?
It's a long question, so I'm actually trying to disaggregate it and break it down.
It's a very specific question that and Anthony and I work together, so we talk about this. But it's particularly just to how to optimally do neuroimaging analysis when you're trying to pool data, and not every site has males and females or cases and controls. And then how do you do that aggregation? How do you control for a scanner while also including when it's perfectly confounded? So there's a bunch of ways. All of them are kind of ugly. But it's a kind of particular analytic question, and I don't imagine, Anthony, I don't know, but I don't know if there are people on the call here who've got that first-hand experience with that sort of problem. If so, if you have a solution, please do email us.
Any other comments from you, Mariana? Any other questions?
Yeah, there's one more question from Hillary, who said that she had some questions about what people are considering best practices for hormone cycle tracking in users who inject the substances of choice. That might not be clear at this point.
I don't know if people have any best practices. Yeah. If there isn't a specific answer, also mindful of the time, perhaps we can follow up anyway with an email and asking people and pull some answers together as well. I don't know if there's any, unless anyone has a specific resource in terms of guidelines. No? Okay. So I think, Erin, just checking, are we about 3 minutes of wrapping up? Great. Okay, just mindful of time. So I think it's probably time to come together and draw this to a close. I just wanted to thank everyone for sticking around. We're the last people standing. There's some interesting themes that have come up. I think something as well that comes to mind is that there's a lot of biases that we inherit naturally as a result of scientific practices, that we generated some biases we wouldn't even think about generating, right? I'm even thinking about left-handed females who have addiction, and you usually many studies exclude for left-handed females, for example. And so basically, if you're a left-handed female with addiction, we don't really have much to give you in terms of mapping the mechanism. So there's just some really bizarre things that just come up from how we conduct our research, in addition to biases in recruitment of more males than females and all of that. But anyway, in the interest of time, I'm just going to be brief, just a couple of closing remarks. So thanks everyone for a truly terrific workshop, for sharing excellent work, a lot of cutting edge work. I wasn't expecting. Some of the findings were absolutely incredible and really cutting edge. So thanks everyone. It was very, very inspiring. And I really liked, again, that the findings spanned from basic experimental studies to more clinical work, to imaging in addiction, rather than in prevalence rates in public health. So it was truly multidisciplinary, which is what we are aiming for, to triangulate this problem. And thanks in particular to the organizers, to the volunteers, to all the chairs, and all the presenters and the audience. And we're planning again to work on this consensus-based framework based on today's work, and probably we're going to have follow-ups. Hopefully people are interested. I think to hold ourselves accountable, we probably need to check in perhaps in a year's time or something like that. And let us know if you're interested in contributing to this in any way. Thanks again for joining forces, and hopefully this work from today inspires everyone for filling these gaps, and this hopefully will lead to improving treatment, public health, and advanced knowledge. So thanks everyone again for a great workshop, and have a lovely weekend ahead. Thanks everyone again.
Thank you, Valentina. This was really great.
Thank you.
Great way to start the weekend.
Cheers, Rita and Ziva. Great. I'm just going to stay, probably I'm just going to stay connected.